Hey Bio 20s, I'm back again for another lesson. Today we are going to be starting off talking about the digestive system and specifically the digestion of carbohydrates in the digestive system. So I do want to start off by going through the structures of the digestive system. Beginning at the top here, we have the oral cavity, it's your mouth. We have the salivary glands that produce saliva, and we have the pharynx back here. That's actually a structure that's shared by both the digestive and the respiratory system. There is another tube that branches off from here called the trachea. We'll talk about that during the respiratory system. For the digestive part, we have the esophagus leading to the stomach, then the small intestine, and the large intestine. Now, these are digestive structures, but they're not technically structures that food pass through. We have the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. You can't really see the pancreas, but it's actually tucked in behind the stomach. So these are main structures of the digestive system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each structure and how each structure works in regards to carbohydrate breakdown. Then in the next video, I'm going to talk about the same thing, but regarding fat breakdown, and then I'm going to do the same thing talking about protein breakdown. So those are your three main macronutrients, macro meaning main or major amounts. So you're looking for a large amount of carbs, fats, and proteins in some percentage in your diet. So carbohydrates, they will be the fast source of energy in your body. So the main job of a carbohydrate is to provide you with energy. Now we just finished talking about cellular respiration and how cellular respiration takes glucose and turns it into ATP. Glucose is essentially the building block for carbohydrates. So what we need to do is take our carbohydrates, use our digestive system to turn it into glucose, and then use that glucose for cellular respiration. So it's fast, it's immediate, and essentially carbs are your body's primary source of energy. Now also they make the largest component of most diets, keyword most, not all diets. Some diets you might be a little higher in fat or protein, but for most people carbs should make up a decent chunk of your diet, and the human body cannot make carbohydrates, so we have to get them from plant sources. And those sources include a variety of things like fruits, vegetables, rice, pasta, bread. All of these would be examples of carbohydrates where we would get our energy from. Now, when we talk about carbohydrates, there's a few classifications we can give. So a basic, simple sugar, simple carbohydrate we refer to as a monosaccharide. Examples of monosaccharides would be glucose, we've already talked about glucose, fructose, and galactose. These are also what we call isomers of one another. This is a chemistry term meaning same molecular formula, so C6H12O6, different chemical structures. So these would be built differently but have the same formula. And these are what we call monosaccharides, mono meaning one. Now, if we were to put two monosaccharides together, we would get a disaccharide, so di meaning two. So if I take two molecules of glucose and I add them together, I now have a disaccharide, and that disaccharide would be maltose, glucose plus glucose. If I took a glucose molecule and added it with a fructose molecule, I'm jumping ahead here. If I take a glucose molecule, add it with a fructose molecule, I get sucrose. And then if I were to go ahead and take glucose and galactose, I get lactose, which is found in most dairy products. Now, all of these reactions are formed by what's called a dehydration synthesis. What that means is that we take two smaller molecules, we jam them together, push them together to make a larger molecule, and we take out water in the process. So water is removed during this reaction where we take our, say, glucose plus glucose equals maltose. So base level, we have our monosaccharides. Next level, we have our disaccharides. And then the upper level, which is many monosaccharides put together, we have polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are essentially a chain of monosaccharides. So it's basically a chain of simple sugar units. And this can include things like starch, glycogen, and cellulose. Starch and cellulose we find in plants, so cellulose can help with the structure of the plant cell wall, starch more so in terms of a longer storage of energy, and we actually find some in the human body too. We call it glycogen. It's how animals store excess carbohydrates. Okay, so let's talk about the ingestion part. So when we talk about digestions, there's essentially four main components. The first one is my favorite component, ingestion. It's eating the food. So we take a big bite of our toast in the morning, or we're eating something carbohydrate based. We are biting it, we are ingesting it. That's going to be step number one in the process. We have to eat the food to begin this process. Number two is going to be to digest the food we're eating. And this can be a couple of ways here. We can do it physically by ripping apart the food, chewing the food, and chemically by essentially using chemical molecules called enzymes. Then we're going to use absorption, where we're going to absorb the nutrients into our blood, into our cells, and then finally we're going to have egestion, which is the removal of anything we didn't need, the removal of waste. So it's a four-step process. So the process begins in the mouth. When you take a bite of something, when you eat something, that's your very first step. And this is what we call physical mechanical digestion, where you are physically breaking down the food. Your teeth, it's grinding, it's chomping, it's crushing, it's tearing the food into little tiny pieces. It's like if I took a piece of paper and ripped the paper into small pieces, it's still paper, just smaller pieces of paper. So it's the same idea. It's still toast, right? It's still bread, just smaller pieces of bread. And one, makes it much easier to swallow, and two, it increases the surface area to allow for chemical digestion to occur faster. Now, there is actually a little bit of chemical digestion in the mouth. This is why we start with carbohydrates, because fats, proteins, they are not chemically digested until later on in the process, but carbs, they are chemically digested. So they are chemically digested beginning in your mouth. So your salivary glands produce saliva. Saliva is a fluid that helps lubricate your food, make it easier to swallow, but it also contains an enzyme called amylase. Now, amylase is going to come in, coat your food, take those complex carbohydrates like your starches and your cellulose and those fibers, right? The complex long chain polysaccharides, and amylase is going to start to chop those down into smaller chains. So not only are we physically digesting our carbohydrates in our mouth, we're also chemically digesting them as well. So chemical digestion of carbs will begin in the mouth. Now, once you're done chewing, you're going to swallow your food, and that food is going to then travel down your esophagus as a big lump of undigested food called a bolus. And it's going to move down your esophagus by involuntary muscle contractions of the smooth muscles of the esophagus called peristalsis. This peristaltic movement is going to push the food from the opening of your esophagus all the way to the end and then into your stomach. Now your stomach has essentially two openings, a top and a bottom, and those openings are called sphincters. We have our lower esophageal sphincter, or the LES. This is where the esophagus connects to the stomach. And then we have our pyloric sphincter, which connects to the small intestine. So this will open up, allow food to drop into the stomach, and then it will close back up so nothing goes back up the esophagus. Once food is in the stomach, there's essentially three things that are produced. We have mucus, hydrochloric acid, and we have pepsinogen/pepsin. These are what we call gastric fluids. These are fluids produced in your stomach. The main job of the stomach is to basically think of it like a blender, where it's going to toss the food around, mix it around, liquefy it, physically break it down even further. So all that food we just ate, it's going to be physically broken down even further. Now, we have the HCl, which is, yes, hydrochloric acid. You do have pretty strong acid within your stomach. And the reason you have it is because sometimes when we eat food, our hands aren't super clean, the food might not be super clean, there might be some germs or bacteria on there that can make us very, very sick. What we're going to need to do is make sure that all those things are killed before this enters into our blood. So it's actually part of your immune system as well, is the hydrochloric acid in your stomach. Now, because of that, it's a very, very acidic environment, like a pH of 2 or less, very, very acidic. So the amylase that was produced in your salivary glands is now no longer active. So the amylase is no longer working. So there's actually no chemical digestion of carbs. And there's no chemical digestion of fats. It's actually proteins that get chemically digested. And that's going to be the enzyme pepsin, which we'll talk about in a later video. Finally, we want to make sure that the strong acid doesn't actually start digesting the stomach itself, which would be very bad. So we actually produce a layer of mucus to coat and protect the stomach from that hydrochloric acid. Finally, once the food has sat in your stomach for enough time, it can enter the small intestine, and your small intestine has three main parts. The most chemical digestion part occurs in the first 25-30 centimeters in your duodenum, or duodenum, however you want to pronounce it. This is where the majority of chemical digestion will occur. Now, before we begin chemical digestion, we have to remember this food is super acidic. So it's really acidic. We want to make sure that we protect our small intestine, because in your small intestine, you have these little tiny projections called villi. Now, the villi inside of them have a connection to the blood in a capillary and a connection to the lymphatic system called the lacteal. And what happens is, when the food gets broken down to the point where we can actually absorb it, it will actually move through the wall of the villi into either the capillary or the lacteal, and then either into your blood or your lymphatic system. So it looks something like this. So here's your villi. Inside we have our capillary, which is essentially a combination of an artery and a vein, and this green tube here would be a lymphatic vessel or a lacteal, which connects to your lymphatic system. Eventually it all ends up in your blood anyway, because your lymphatic system is connected to your blood as well. But the main thing here is we want to make sure that these villi aren't damaged by the acidic food that's coming in. So the very acidic food coming in, the chyme that's coming in, is partially digested. It's really acidic, so before we even start absorbing or chemically digesting this food, we need to neutralize it. Now remember I said the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, food doesn't actually travel through, but they're really important? Well, here's where the pancreas steps in. The pancreas is going to produce a compound. It's a basic compound. They're called bicarbonate ions, and they are essentially a basic molecule that will neutralize the acidic food coming into the small intestine. So it kind of works like this. We have an inactive form called secretin. So secretin is just kind of sitting around in your small intestine waiting. Once that food enters the small intestine, there's some hydrochloric acid with it, very acidic. It will turn the prosecretin into its active form called secretin. Now secretin in its active form will immediately go into the blood, up to the pancreas, and basically signal the pancreas, hey, there's food in the small intestine. We got to make sure that it is neutralized. So the pancreas will now make a compound, the bicarbonate ions, which will then travel through a little pancreatic duct back into your small intestine, neutralizing all that food in the first couple of centimeters there. So now that we have our food, it's been physically broken down in our mouth, it's been physically broken down in our stomach further, we've chemically broken the carbs down a little bit in our mouth, and now we've neutralized it. We can move on to the very last step, which is going to be breaking down the carbohydrates further in the small intestine and then absorbing them into the blood. So the two enzymes that we're going to use more amylase. This time it's going to come from the pancreas, and we're going to use an enzyme called disaccharidase. And there's some different types of disaccharidase, like for example, maltase will break down maltose, lactase will break down lactose, things like that. So what we're going to end up doing is those somewhat digested polysaccharides, we're going to break them down into disaccharides. So the amylase from the pancreas is going to break the polysaccharides into disaccharides. And then finally, the disaccharidase, which comes from the small intestine, is going to break the disaccharides into the monosaccharides. So it's honestly like if you just had like a chain, right? And we just break the chain into the individual pieces. It's like a chain of paper clips, and then you just unlink the paper clips. Now we have our monosaccharides, which would be your glucose, your fructose, and your galactose. Once we get to the monosaccharide stage, we can then absorb the glucose, absorb the sugar through the villi directly into the blood, directly through the capillaries, and then it can go right into our cells for cell respiration. So you can kind of see all these systems are connected, right? So we got the digestive system, putting nutrients into our blood, blood taking the nutrients to our cells, and then cells using that energy for cellular respiration. Finally, so that's it for carbs. So that's what happens to our piece of toast once we eat it. But there might still be a little bit of stuff left over, like some vitamins, some minerals, some water. That, still partially undigested food, or sorry, partially digested food, I should say, partially digested food, will go into the large intestine. In the large intestine, this is where the leftovers will hang out. There's a bunch of good bacteria in here that really helps us with a lot of the vitamins and minerals we need. So it's a really good relationship we have with them. If you ever heard of probiotics before, like yogurt has a lot of good probiotics, really good for your gut bacteria. That's what we're talking about, the bacteria that live in your large intestine. So the leftover food, after it's gone through the chemical digestion and absorption in the small intestine, will then go through a little bit more digestion. So we're actually going to take out some water, we're going to take out some vitamins, we're going to take out some minerals, and then anything left over is waste, which will store in our colon until it's time to get rid of it. So that's essentially what happens to your carbohydrates. Next video, we're going to talk about what happens to fats. So we're going to talk about the main roles and jobs of fats, where fats come from, and then what happens to fats when they break down. So thanks again for watching, and we'll chat soon.